Hello and welcome back. Settle in once more. Let the demands of your day dissolve, and allow your mind to journey with me. Let us return to the dark, damp fields of rural Bavaria, to a place where the silence screams louder than any cry for help. In our last journey, we walked the blood-soaked ground of a remote farmstead. We bore witness to the horrific aftermath of an almost unimaginable crime. We stood in the stillness of Hinterkaifeck and contemplated the brutal, systematic slaughter of 6 people. And we were confronted with the even more chilling fact that their killer, after committing this atrocity, remained on the farm, living amongst the dead for days. Tonight, we move from the visceral, what, to the intellectual and psychological who. We are going to put on the caps of historical detectives, of criminal profilers, and of patient investigators. We will delve deep into the heart of the official police investigation itself, or what passed for one in 1922. We will sift through the evidence, both the physical scraps that survived and the more potent psychological clues left behind in the twisted relationships of the victims. We will dissect the primary suspects, one by one, examining their motives, their means, and their opportunities with the critical eye. We will analyze the strange, unsettling, and often contradictory clues left behind at the scene, clues that seem to point in a dozen different directions at once. This is a deep dive into the suspects and the swirling theories that have made Germany's greatest unsolved German crime a fixture of dark fascination for a full century. This is the Hinterkaifeck murders, the suspects. Our goal tonight is not just to catalog the crime, but to understand precisely why, after 100 years of searching, this profoundly disturbing cold case remains so stubbornly, so terrifyingly unsolved. Before we can begin to point the finger of suspicion, we must first fully appreciate the landscape of the investigation, or more accurately, the wasteland. The initial handling of the Hinterkaifeck crime scene was, by any modern standard, a complete and utter catastrophe. It was a textbook example of how not to conduct a murder investigation. The crime scene, a remote farmstead miles from the nearest town and police station, was not secured. It was not preserved. It was, in fact, immediately and irrevocably contaminated. In the hours and days following the discovery of the bodies on that gray Tuesday afternoon, April 4, 1922, the farm became a grotesque sort of public spectacle. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire through the small, tight-knit communities of Weidhofen and Groburn. Dozens of people, neighbors, relatives of the victims, local villagers, and morbid curiosity seekers from further afield descended upon the farm. They tramped through the property with their muddy boots. They walked through the house, through the barn, their morbid curiosity overriding any sense of propriety or caution. They touched objects. They moved furniture. They opened cupboards. They peered at the bloodstains on the walls and floor, whispering their theories, and with every single footstep, with every touch, they obliterated what little forensic evidence might have survived the crime. The investigators from the Munich Police Department, led by the experienced and well-regarded Chief Inspector George Reingruber, arrived to find a scene of utter chaos. They were faced with a puzzle whose pieces had already been scattered to the winds. The scientific tools available to them were primitive. Fingerprinting was still a relatively new and specialized science, and was not comprehensively employed at a rural crime scene like this. Blood evidence was noted, the sheer volume of it was impossible to ignore, but the ability to analyze it was limited to determining if it was human. The concept of blood typing existed, but it was not a standard investigative tool. The world-changing discovery of the structure of DNA was still 3 decades in the future. Inspector Reingruber and his team were working with little more than witness statements, their own intuition, and the raw physical horror of the scene itself. The murder weapon, a heavy farming mattock belonging to the Gruber family, was found in the barn, leaning against a post, caked in blood and hair. But in a world before DNA testing, it could only tell them how the victims were killed, not who had wielded the tool with such savage force. The autopsies performed right there on the barn floor confirmed the cause of death for all 6 victims. Extreme blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with vicious, repeated blows. But then came one of the most bizarre turns in the entire investigation, a decision that speaks volumes about the desperation of the investigators and the strange, liminal space the investigation occupied between the dawn of police science and the twilight of folk superstition. The heads of the 6 victims were severed from their bodies and sent to Munich. There they were presented to a number of famous clairvoyants and psychics, in the desperate and ultimately fruitless hope that these mystics might somehow channel the victims' last moments and reveal the killer's identity. The heads were eventually lost, likely destroyed in the Allied bombings of Munich during World War II. A final macabre punctuation mark on a fundamentally failed investigation. So, with a hopelessly contaminated scene and a dearth of scientific tools, the police were forced to fall back on the most traditional form of detective work: establishing motive. Who had a reason to want the Gruber family dead? This single question led them down a dark and tangled path of local feuds, bitter financial disputes, dark family secrets, and the lingering ghosts of the Great War. Over the next decade, more than 100 suspects were officially interviewed, investigated, and in some cases harassed. Let us now walk in the muddy footsteps of Inspector Reingruber and examine the most prominent among them, the men whose names have become forever entwined with the legend of Hinterkaifeck. We must begin where the police began, and where almost every analysis of this case has begun for the last 100 years. We must begin with the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He has always been and remains suspect number 1. On the surface, Schlittenbauer was a respectable, even powerful, figure in the small community of Weidhofen. He was a successful farmer, a former mayor of the town, a man of some standing and influence. But his life was inextricably, and as it would turn out, fatally, entangled with the strange and troubled family at Hinterkaifeck. His primary connection, the nexus of all the trouble, was Victoria Gabriel. It was what the Germans call an offenes Geheimnis, an open secret that the two had been engaged in a long-standing, passionate, and deeply complicated affair. This relationship was volatile and fraught with tension. Schlittenbauer was a married man for much of it, but his first wife had died in 1918 under tragic and somewhat mysterious circumstances. The affair with Victoria, a young and lonely war widow, seems to have intensified after his wife's death. But the most critical point of contention, the issue that festered between them, was the paternity of Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph. Publicly, Victoria had named Schlittenbauer as the father. To avoid further scandal, he had reluctantly signed legal documents acknowledging this and was paying her regular child support, or alimenti. But privately, he appears to have harbored deep doubts and a burning resentment. The entire village was rife with rumors that were almost certainly true, that the real father of both of Victoria's children was her own father, the tyrannical Andreas Gruber. For a proud, prominent man like Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the situation was a source of constant public humiliation and a significant financial drain. Was he being forced to pay for another man's incestuous offspring? Was Victoria using this secret to blackmail him for more money? This gives us our first powerful tangible motive. A toxic, volatile mixture of romantic jealousy, public shame, and financial rage. It is not hard to imagine a scenario. Picture Schlittenbauer, on that stormy Friday night, making his way to the farm to confront Victoria and Andreas. Perhaps he had finally had enough of the payments. Perhaps he had discovered definitive proof that Joseph was not his son, and that he had been made a fool of in front of the entire community. The argument escalates. The notoriously hot-tempered Andreas Gruber responds with threats or violence. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, a raptus, Schlittenbauer, a strong farmer, could have grabbed the nearest heavy tool, the matacand, lashed out. This theory of a spontaneous, rage-filled explosion of violence is compelling. It provides a clear motive and a plausible suspect with a known capacity for confrontation. but it struggles to account for the methodical, systematic nature of the crime. If he killed Andreas in a blind fit of rage, why then proceed to murder 5 other people, including 2 small, innocent children? A crime of passion is typically chaotic, focused on the object of the rage. This was a structured slaughter. And more importantly, why stay? Why would a respected community leader, after committing such a horrific, passion-fueled act, remain on the farm for 3 full days, tending the cattle, feeding the chickens, and eating the family's food? This suggests a level of cold-blooded composure and psychological detachment that seems profoundly at odds with a spontaneous crime of passion. However, it is Schlittenbauer's own actions and statements in the immediate aftermath of the discovery that only served to deepen the cloud of suspicion that hung over him. He was the one who, after 4 days of silence from the farm, organized the search party. This could be seen as the act of a concerned and responsible neighbor, or it could be seen as the calculated act of a killer wanting to control the discovery of his own crime, to ensure the bodies were found before they decomposed further. When he and the other 2 men entered the barn and found the horrific scene, his behavior was, by all accounts, profoundly bizarre. Multiple witnesses, including the other men with him, later testified that he seemed oddly unsurprised, almost detached, from the horror he had just uncovered. One of the men, Michael Pohl, later gave a formal statement that Schlittenbauer casually disturbed the crime scene, moving the bodies around with his foot and pulling away the hay, before the police had even been summoned. Schlittenbauer's public explanation for this was that he was frantically searching for his son, Joseph, whom he believed might be buried under the hay. But this explanation has always rung hollow to many, especially since he would have known the 2-year-old was almost certainly in the house. Was he really looking for his son? Or was he perhaps looking for something else? A piece of evidence he had left behind? Furthermore, in the years that followed the murders, strange stories began to emerge from the village, whispers that attached themselves to Schlittenbauer like burrs. A local teacher claimed that in the 1920s, he had overheard Schlittenbauer boasting to a group of villagers about how he had broken a bloody mattock and had hidden it in his attic. Another pervasive rumor, one that has become a cornerstone of the Hinterkaifeck legend, is that Schlittenbauer made a full deathbed confession to a local priest just before he died. There is, however, no proof of this, and it is likely just another piece of the rich folklore that has grown up around the case. In the 2007 forensic psychology analysis by the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy students, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was reportedly their unnamed prime suspect. They likely pointed to his clear and powerful motive, his deeply suspicious behavior at the crime scene, his intimate knowledge of the farm and the Gruber family's routines, and his physical ability to carry out the attack. He knew the layout of the buildings. He knew the family's secrets. He had a powerful reason to want them silenced. Yet, for all the heavy circumstantial evidence, for all the whispers and rumors and suspicious behavior, the police in the 1920s could never find a single piece of hard, physical evidence to definitively link him to the crime. There was no bloody clothing found at his home. There was no definitive witness who saw him go to the farm that night. Lorenz Schlittenbauer lived out the rest of his long life in Weidhofen, dying in 1941, a man forever defined by the dark cloud of Hinterkaifeck. He remains suspect number 1, the plausible, logical, yet ultimately unprovable face of the crime. If Lorenz Schlittenbauer represents the theory of a crime of passion born from local disputes and tangled relationships, then our next major suspect represents something entirely different, something more mythic. A ghost from the past returned for a terrible and bloody revenge. This is the theory of Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, the soldier who was supposedly killed in the war. Officially, Carl Gabriel was listed as killed in action in December 1914, during the fierce fighting near Arras in France. His body was never recovered, a tragically common fate for millions of soldiers in the meat grinder of the First World War. He was, for all official and legal purposes, dead. But what if he wasn't? The theory posits that Karl Gabriel, against all odds, survived the war. Perhaps he was taken as a prisoner of war by the Russians and was only released years later, in the chaotic post-war prisoner exchanges. Perhaps he was a deserter who, unwilling to return to the army, lived under an assumed name for years. He eventually makes his way back across a shattered Europe to his home in Bavaria, a man brutalized, traumatized, and irrevocably changed by the horrors of war. He returns to Hinterkaifeck, not as a celebrated hero, but as a ghost walking out of the past. And what does he find? He finds his wife, the woman he left behind, deeply enmeshed in a notorious and publicly confirmed incestuous relationship with her own father. He finds she has a 2-year-old son who is clearly not his. His home, his name, his family, his honor all have been corrupted and shamed in his absence. In this scenario, the motive is pure, undiluted rage, coupled with the twisted sense of justice. A soldier, a man trained in the efficient application of violence, returns to find his entire world has been defiled. He decides to wipe the slate clean, to eradicate the source of his dishonor with the same ruthlessness he learned in the trenches. He systematically executes the entire family, an act of almost military-style precision. This theory has a certain grim cinematic appeal. It provides a powerful emotional engine for the crime. A good man, a soldier driven mad by betrayal and the horrors of war. And it is not a theory born entirely of fantasy. It is supported by a series of tantalizing, if unverifiable, whispers from the past. Several of Karl Gabriel's former comrades from his army regiment came forward after the murders were publicized to state that they were certain he had not died in 1914. They claimed the report of his death was an error, and that they had seen him alive after that date. More tantalizingly, in the early 1930s, a school teacher from Schrobenhausen came forward with the remarkable story. She claimed that she had taken a confession from a dying woman who years earlier had sheltered a Russian deserter after the war. This deserter, who spoke fluent German, had confessed to her that he was, in fact, the thought-to-be-dead Karl Gabriel, and that he had single-handedly committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. After the woman's death, the teacher reported this story to the authorities, but the trail was impossibly cold. This theory also neatly explains the killer's apparent ability to remain unseen on the farm in the days leading up to the crime. A trained soldier would possess the skills of stealth, fieldcraft, and survival needed to live secretly in the woods or the attic, observing his targets. And a soldier would certainly know how to handle himself in a violent, close-quarters confrontation. However, like the Schlittenbauer theory, the Karl Gabriel theory rests on a fragile foundation of hearsay and speculation. There is no definitive proof that he survived the war. His military records, which were meticulously kept, show him as deceased. No one ever came forward who could definitively say, "I am Karl Gabriel." He remains a phantom, a compelling narrative that fits the psychological profile of the crime, but a narrative without a central character who can be proven to have existed after 1914. He is the spectral suspect, the ghost in the bloody machine of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Beyond these two primary, and very different suspects, the police investigation spiraled outwards, looking at a host of other local figures and outsiders, creating a complex and confusing web of potential motives. A significant amount of police time and resources was spent investigating two brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump. Their sister, Crescentia, had once worked as a maid at Hinterkaifeck and claimed to have been in a relationship with Andreas Gruber. She also claimed he was the father of her child, a claim Andreas fiercely denied. There was, to put it mildly, bad blood between the Gump family and the Grubers. Could the two brothers have sought a violent revenge for their sister's honor, or perhaps for money they felt they were owed? Years after the murders, a Catholic priest came forward with a story that a woman named Therese T. had made a deathbed confession to him. In her confession, she claimed that her two brothers, who she did not name but were presumed to be the Gump brothers, had committed the murders. This led to a brief reopening of the case, but no new evidence could be found to support the claim. The Gump brothers, like so many others, were suspects caught in the swirling vortex of rumor and innuendo that surrounded the cursed farm. The police also seriously investigated a man named Carl S., a local man from Weidhofen who was a known member of a Freikorps UNITA right-wing paramilitary group active in the political violence of the Weimar Republic. He became a suspect because a friend of his, who had also once worked as a maid at Hinterkaifeck, claimed that Carl S. had confessed the crime to him while they were both serving time in prison on an unrelated charge. The story was that he and his brother had gone to the farm with the intention of robbing it, and the robbery had turned into a massacre when the Grubers resisted. However, when questioned by police, Carl S. vehemently denied everything, and his brother was able to provide him with a solid alibi for the night of the murders. The lead, like so many others, went nowhere. This brings us to the final, and to many the most deeply unsettling possibility of all. It is the theory of the unknown killer. This is the phantom theory. It suggests that the perpetrator was a complete outsider, a person with no personal connection to the family, no history with the village, no place in the web of local gossip. He was a drifter, a vagrant, one of the many thousands of men displaced and brutalized by the war and the subsequent economic turmoil of post-war Germany. Or perhaps he was something even more terrifying. A mentally disturbed individual, a psychopath who wandered the countryside like a shark, looking for a target of opportunity. This theory elegantly explains the series of strange, almost supernatural events that preceded the murders. The newspaper from Munich found in the attic? Left by a stranger who had been secretly living there. The single set of footprints in the snow that led to the farm but not away? The phantom had entered the outbuildings to hide from the storm. The strange noises in the attic, the missing house keys? All signs of a methodical intruder who was already inside. A predator who had made the farm his territory long before he made his final deadly move. In this scenario, the motive is either terrifyingly simple or terrifyingly complex. It could have been a robbery that went spectacularly violently wrong. The phantom, seeking food or money, confronts Andreas, who, being the man he was, resists fiercely. The phantom kills him, and then, in a state of panicked rage or cold calculation, eliminates all the witnesses one by one. Or the motive could be something much darker, something that defies rational explanation. A pure, motiveless malignancy. The act of a killer who kills for the sheer sake of it, for the feeling of power and the thrill of transgression. The most chilling aspect of this theory is how perfectly it explains the killer's bizarre actions after the murders. If the killer was a homeless, starving, and half-mad drifter, then the farm, now suddenly and violently empty, would have seemed like a paradise. A warm house, a stock pantry, fresh milk from the cows, eggs from the chickens, a soft bed to sleep in. For a man who had absolutely nothing, Hinterkaifeck was now everything. He was no longer a phantom hiding in the attic. He was the master of the house. So he stayed. He fed the cows because their lowing would attract attention. He stoked the fire for warmth. He cooked and ate the family's food. He lived out a bizarre and grotesque domestic fantasy amidst the carnage he had created. This bizarre combination of extreme violence and quiet domesticity is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing element of the entire Hinterkaifeck case. A detail that makes it a prime candidate for a true crime documentary, exploring the darkest corners of criminal psychology. This phantom theory is so terrifying precisely because it is unprovable and unsolvable by its very nature. The killer came from nowhere, and he vanished back into nowhere, leaving behind no name, no history, and no trail for the police to follow. He is the ultimate dead end, a ghost who committed a real-world atrocity. So we are left with a constellation of suspects and theories, each compelling in its own way, and each fatally flawed by a lack of definitive proof. Lorenz Schlittenbauer had the motive, the means, and the opportunity, but his actions don't perfectly fit the psychological profile of the crime. and there is no physical evidence linking him to the scene. Carl Gabriel provides a powerful emotional narrative of revenge, but he may not have even been alive to commit the crime. The other local suspects are tied to the case by little more than flimsy rumor and second-hand deathbed confessions. And the phantom killer is the perfect explanation for the strangeness of the crime, but an explanation that, by its very nature, can never be proven. This is precisely why Hinterkaifeck endures as Germany's greatest unsolved German crime. The clues point in too many directions at once, creating a fog of uncertainty. The missing house key could suggest a local who had stolen or copied it, like Schlittenbauer, who had intimate access. The footprints from the deep woods could suggest an outsider, a complete stranger, like the phantom. The extreme personal violence of the mattock, a tool of the earth, could suggest a crime of passion, an explosion of rage from a neighbor. The methodical, systematic execution of 6 people, including children, could suggest a cold-blooded, calculating killer like a traumatized soldier. The evidence is a series of baffling contradictions. The case file is like a mirror that reflects back whatever theory the observer brings to it. The final piece of this tragic puzzle is the farm itself. Hinterkaifeck was a place that was both physically and psychologically isolated. It was a pressure cooker of dark, corrosive secrets: incest, abuse, disputed paternity, greed, and bitterness. This toxic atmosphere made it a place where violence could easily fester. It created a deep and murky pool of potential suspects, any one of whom might have been pushed past their breaking point on that stormy night. The ultimate tragedy of Hinterkaifeck is not just that 6 people were brutally murdered, but that the life they lived created a world where almost anyone could have been a suspect, and where the truth became irrevocably buried under thick layers of shame, lies, and fear. A year after the murders, in the spring of 1923, the farmstead of H. Hinterkaifeck was completely demolished. The house, the barn, the machine shed, all were torn down, the foundations filled in, the ground plowed over and returned to empty fields. It was a communal act of deliberate erasure, a desperate attempt by the community to wipe the physical stain of the crime from the landscape. But you cannot demolish a memory. You cannot tear down a ghost. The story of Hinterkaifeck lived on, a dark whisper in the quiet Bavarian fields, a testament to the fact that some questions are so terrible, they may never, ever have an answer. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the suspects and the frustrating, fascinating theories of this enduring cold case. It is a crime that forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes, the darkness is not an external force that breaks in, but something that grows quietly from within a community, a family, a single human heart. Now, I turn the final phase of the investigation over to you. After weighing the evidence, the motives, and the psychology against the primary suspects, where do you believe the truth lies? Was this a crime of local passion committed by the resentful and suspicious Lorenz Schlittenbauer? Was it a soldier's terrible revenge, carried out by the ghost of Carl Gabriel? Or was it the random, terrifying act of an unknown phantom, a man without a name and without a motive we can comprehend? Which theory do you find most convincing, and why? Please share your detailed thoughts and your own analysis in the comments below. The collective wisdom and insight of this community is one of the most fascinating parts of exploring these deep and troubling historical mysteries. If you found this detailed analysis of an unsolved German crime compelling, and if you appreciate this true crime documentary approach to history, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth explorations of history's most baffling cases. And be sure to click that notification bell, so you won't miss our next journey into the shadows. Until then, may your nights be peaceful and free from the whispers of the past.